Yeah, so we're here I've just recently remixed the Live at Joshua Tree RÜFÜS Do Soul album, which was just been released on the Apple Music Spatial Audio player, and we're here to talk about the project. Yeah, so back in 2019, we went out into Joshua Tree, into the desert, and picked up the entire show with backline and consoles and everything, and plonked it in the middle of a remote location, and shot this project, 8 songs, which were adapted from the live set and performed live. The initial intent for the project was to be for Mix magazine initially, and it was just going to be an online free streamed thing. Still had some intent for it to be shot and captured well. And as the project kind of went along, it took its own evolution and ended up kind of growing. As the director started to cut it, we got some really magical kind of scenes out there at dusk. So the project was shot at dusk into the night. So we had a really small window to be able to capture it, to which we did two takes of each song. And that was a tight shot and a wide. So we had a really big drone there, which was taking some incredible desert shots and some wide stuff as well. But yeah, we had a tiny little window to capture it all. And we did. As the project evolved, as I was saying, the director was cutting it and putting it together, and it kind of became more of a, it evolved itself, and we ended up mixing it for theatrical release and put it into cinemas, and I mixed it at a dub stage in LA. So when we went into the studio, the mix engineer said, there's many ways that we can go about this. We can either create a theatrical mix of this, or we just mix it in Dolby Atmos from the start, and explained about the fold down processes and how that would work. But he thought that was the best intent for us to do that, to which we did. To back up a little bit, I had completed the 2-track master that had been mastered and was ready for release on the streaming platforms. And then the discussion came into play about, could we look at doing a theatrical release of this? What would that undertake and involve? To which we got the studio to create some effects beds to transition the songs in and out. And that's when we decided to do that and mix it in Dolby Atmos. So I was, somewhat familiar, and we'd kind of gone through that process earlier on. COVID hit, that was shelved. The intent was for it to be rolled out worldwide. There was an IMAX master of that, and it was premiered here in Melbourne. And that was supposed to be rolled out bigger as well. But so it got shelved and put away. A year down the track, or 3 months ago now, we'll get a frantic call from management and the label saying, remember that Atmos mix that we did way back in 2020? This, obviously talks about, or at that time, Apple Music were releasing spatial audio on their player. We need to pull this off the shelf, dust it off, and see what this thing sounds like, and see, and can we quickly get this turned around and get this delivered for Apple too. This is where Angus came into play. So Angus and I had been in discussions a few months earlier, talking about the format, and I had obviously discussed the project with him and said how we had initially mixed it in Dolby Atmos. And around this time, before we knew about the Apple Music release of spatial audio, I reached back out to that Los Angeles studio to attain the ADM file, because I just wanted to hear it again. It had been a year since. And then obviously Angus was like, well, I've just built a Dolby certified room. You got to get out here and have a listen to it. But, you were deep in mixing a film at the time. And there was small windows to try to get that opportunity. But
well, it's a sort of serendipitous story, because initially I found out about Cam through Drew Parsons at Avid. And Drew and I had been talking for some time about the fact that we didn't feel that live immersive audio was as good as it could be. And in the other hat I wear is as a director of technical support for KV2 Audio, which is a great speaker manufacturer. And so, I said to Drew, well, look, with our speakers, with the Avid S6L and a piece of software that he'd identified, we could create a live immersive audio scenario that would be at a fraction of the cost of conventional available formats, and something that would be attainable by average bands rather than just your top 5%. And so that's how that whole conversation started. So originally, I've always had a studio here, not this studio, I can assure you, but it's been a mastering studio, it's been a mixing and recording studio in various forms. But I decided, well, okay, let's look into the immersive thing. So I started talking through Drew and reaching out to different people. So Cam was certainly at the top of the heap, particularly because of what he'd been doing with RÜFÜS, but also guys like Julian Spink, who was at the time with System Sound, who's a very well-regarded theatrical sound designer who's got decades of experience in that and has done a lot of live immersive audio in that role, and a number of other people who I really wanted to try and get in to help us create a test bed for this live immersive audio platform. So that cut to this year where, or last year I should say, during the lockdown, as with a lot of people, I thought I need a lockdown project. So I thought I already had speakers kind of sitting on couches and old stands and what have you around here, giving a very rough approximation of what an immersive audio setup might be. And the more research I did, the more I realized that it would be silly to create something that was purely dedicated to live immersive audio, that I should base something, and I decided on the Dolby model because it was the most widely researched and the most widely implemented immersive sound or spatial sound model in the world, based on, of course, its cinematic history and then coming into what was starting to happen in live sound and so on, and in music, and decided to base the room design on the Dolby design parameters for a music studio and small well, it's not a sound stage, but on something that could do things like Netflix and what have you, because it made sense to be able to do something that would take conventional recorded immersive content, and the obviously more popular Dolby music content, and then have that translate into a live immersive format that essentially used the same system. So it would mean that people like Cam could not just come in and mix an album that he'd recorded, but could also come in and go, okay, well, we're going to prepare this album that we've got in the can to go out on tour using hopefully KV2 system, Avid S6L and the appropriate software. And that's sort of how it all came about. As I say, serendipitously, it turned out that not only did Cam have a great project that that was a fantastic test bed, but also that Apple Music, as we all know, recently announced that Dolby Atmos was going to be their adopted format for their streaming spatial audio. And the rest, as I say, is history. The phone started ringing. People were really interested in what we were doing, and that's where we are now. Pretty much. Interesting analogy, Chris. Thanks for that one. Yeah. I think I dodged a bullet. Yeah, it could have been a different story if I was in New South Wales.
Yeah. Yeah. So we obviously, got the original master file from the other studio, and when we listened back to it, it sounded great, but it felt like it could reuse a different mix intent, I think, and that was our, I think that was our belief when we listened back to it.
It was a more theatrical balance, wasn't it?
It was a more theatrical balance, and I remember, we had obviously gone back and revisited that even more so when we did the 5.1 file down, but we had to think of it more in a binaural sense, definitely for the player, and also, let's kind of reinvent that. I think we could replay this and put it more spatially in the room.
And something would stand alone as a musical offering and not have to be tied to the vision.
That's right.
So that you could listen to it and get the impact of the music without it having to be watching the video.
Yeah, that's right. So and that's when we decided to undertake the remix again, start from scratch. By starting from scratch, that was from a stem bed position. I'd obviously had mixed the album a year before, which had been approved by the band and, you know, everybody with that mix intent from the stereo. And the stereo version was already out there, whether it be it on so the film was on YouTube at that stage already, plus the album had been released on the player. So we had to kind of look at, using that, and then thought, you know, how are we going to reinvent this and then put this in this space? Where do you begin? And that was the thing, you know. So wind the clock back. Yep, I was sitting co-chair to an operator that, you know, we're in this big sound stage, and I was completely unaware of, you know, I hadn't used the renderer before, I hadn't mixed in Atmos. It was all very new to me. Obviously familiar being Pro Tools and all of that, but so and then come back to when Angus and I finally sit down, and my assumption would be that that's how we would do this again. You know, I would sit in the co-chair and heat up, and Angus very accommodatingly sat back on the couch and said, no, there you go. You know, this is how you assign an object bed. This is how you pan. You know, I will let you expand on that, I suppose, you know, as to what your belief was. Just
well, I mean, I guess, you know, we've talked about it a bit, but, you know, I think the analogy I used was that it'd be a bit like getting into a Formula One car, you know, with a Formula One driver and me driving and the Formula One driver telling me when to change gears. You know, it kind of didn't make sense. So, you know, you're so you know the band's music so intimately. You've been working with them for almost 10 years, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, 7 years.
Yeah, and plus you recorded this.
Yeah,
and you know the guys, you know the music. You know, it just made sense for me to take a step back and guide you in, you know, in the not the creative, more than the technical process.
Yeah,
and let you go hard. You know.
Yeah,
and you know, I think it worked. I think it worked really well.
Yeah, there definitely was. You know, we really relied on the console as well. I relied on the D command. I spat it all out, had it down there, and obviously, you know, everything sits in the left-right field. And then, you know, we started to go through, and I placed things within the room and kind of, you know, broke it out a little bit more. And then I started digging myself in a little bit of a hole. I started just automating volume rides, and we're getting sections to, you know, kind of push and pull with those certain sections. And I really put myself into a deep hole there. And that's when Angus turned around and said, you know, can I just jump in here? I think you need to kind of re-look at this and think about the mix is the mix, you know, that the intent is already balanced. So think about it more as 14 speakers in a room as opposed to 2. If you want something to be louder, place it in a different position. Think about your placement. Do those movements as opposed to volume rides. And that was a real light bulb moment for me. As soon as I looked at that, really played around with that panning and that real spatial positioning of things. And then I was able to, you know, think more about, does this need to be a bed object or does this become an object? And really start to place that more. The mix just came together. And it really did go back to what the intent was. It went back to what that stereo intent was, that EQ balancing, those volume rides, they were already in there. It was more so about just breaking that open and placing that more in the room.
Yeah, it only took you an hour. I mean, after getting over the initial, you know, chagrin at me telling you you're doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, and it was what I needed to hear.
It was so funny.
Because it was really, I threw my hands up in the air and I was like, no, it's not working. What am I doing? You do it? No. So yeah, I think.
It literally took an hour. I mean, you know, after you'd sort of got yourself settled again and then just kind of changed the direction of the ship and started moving forward, it just happened. And I basically said very little, I think, for almost the rest of the session. There was a couple of things, but once you had it, like, it was sort of, you know, it just unfolded because you know it so well, you know, as well.
There was that. There was the intent of it And then I was getting the feeling of it as well. And that was what really came into play because, you know,
and getting used to the room, right?
Getting used to the room, and then watching it with the picture as well. And, you know, really feeling those sections are going, you know, I think, and that was the creative process that came into play with that. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, having the band in another country, there's a lot of onus put on me for the creative decision of the mix intent and not having them. I'm so accustomed to having them bounce off those ideas. You know, with the conventional 2-track mix, you can quickly print that off, bounce it, put it in the Dropbox. They make some notes, and we all of a sudden have this back and forth. I didn't have that with this. So this comes back to that feeling intent, obviously having recorded it, having mixed it, and having known these songs for this entire time. There was a lot of just that creative intent just came into play, I think. In saying that, I lent on Angus a lot as well. You know, the familiarity of the room. He understands the room. It's his space. So we had a lot of those discussions. You know, is this too much? Have the legs been stretched too far in this sense? Or do we need to go crazy? Does this pan thing need to do this? But being tasteful in it as well. And I remember that because that was the rabbit hole that we'd started to go down on that first intent. And I was like, that didn't translate when we put it in the cinema because things had detached itself from the screen. I just had a vocal and a kick drum and a few elements down in the LCR field, but everything else in a room. So, but this had to be reinvented in a spatial sense. You know, we could put things more in heights and wides and further behind.
And you were really aware of that too. When we started, you were really mentioning, you know, you're very conscious of that, mentioning often, you know, I don't want to go into that same thing. I want to make sure that we're glued to that screen, that we still have that solid foundation and build back from that.
But
don't lose the glue.
But don't lose the glue, you know, and I think that's, our ears are so accustomed to that glue, that little left-right glue that we're so used to getting that balancing.
Which is a very common theme now. You know, it's something that happens more and more that when I'm listening to other engineers talking about mixing in Dolby Atmos is to keep that glue, you know, that whatever you do to move something or place something or have it moving, you know, that you're not ungluing it, that you're not just putting it somewhere for the hell of it and losing the relevance of that in the big picture. So it's a really tweaky thing, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, you can make tiny changes that completely change the impression that you're giving. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I think we had these discussions early on about we chose Dale Becker from Becker Mastering in Los Angeles, which I had known. So we've worked with him previously with all the mastering for all of RÜFÜS. I've got a good rapport and relationship with the mastering engineer, which is key, you know, as an engineer to have those relationships because you can have those discussions. And I knew that he had put a certified PMC Dolby room together. So I was like, well, it just makes sense, you know, how serendipitous is this, that we also have a mastering engineer that's in the same format. So we got on that early and had those discussions with him to talk about, one, his deliverable and, you know, intents and, you know, what the talks are around who's creating in what way and what is the player going to do, what is Apple, how's it going to sound on Apple. And then to that, we lent on him to be like, can we get you a rough across? And we did that, I think, on day one or day two. Much. I was like, let's just get a render done and let's get this submitted to him just to see if we're in the right ballpark. And that wasn't a question on whether is the room balanced. We knew that was the case, but it was, is this right? Is it too far that way? Is it not enough? Am I too much in the center channel? Am I too out wide? Or is it too bright? Is it too dull? All of those things. To which he just came back and he goes, I love it.
Sounds superb.
He goes, it sounds superb. He actually gave me nothing, which was
I know. I was looking at it.
Good or bad, you know, when a mastering engineer is, oh, no, it's great. It's like, what's he going to do to it after it's done? No. But yeah, I think that's what we needed. We needed to engage in that conversation. And that was just the reassurance for us. Then,
and also, you know, at that point too, Apple was very, very vague about what was, you know, what their deliverables were and in fact, what they were delivering. to the format, to what you were hearing down here. And between here and the studio, it was like, no one really knows. Yeah. So, to be able to talk to Dale and make sure that he was getting from us what he needed in terms of, there's some very technical elements of Dolby Atmos that can make a mastering engineer's job incredibly easy or extraordinarily difficult. And making sure that you align those things up, prior to delivering the final product is really important. So things like, keeping the object numbers the same for the different instruments and voices and so on throughout each of the songs. If you don't do that, he's got to go back and reconform the Dolby renderer for every song. So there's a whole lot of kind of stuff that you might think is incidental, but ends up taking a lot of time and then obviously costing a lot of money.
Yeah, so a big consideration was the binaural aspect of the spatial audio, and that was something that Angus and I had really discussed because I'd only ever mixed it in the speaker intent before. So to think about the binaural was something undiscovered for me, and that was something that we had to have a lot of discussions about what that meant. Although it is the same mix, there are different things in play with the renderer as to what you can, where you want to place that object, etc. In that field. So we spent a lot of time going back and forth with that mix. That was critical to QC between the binaural back to the mix. Is something that is sweeping around the room, is that quite translating there? So, and then that was another big chat that we had to have with Dale about that binaural, because at the end of the day, 90% of the consumers will be listening on AirPods, Air Pro Maxes, or whatever that was. So that was really critical for us to, I just remember at the end of the night, I'd go home, I'd listen on, I've got just a consumer home theater set up at home, which has a little, has a, what am I bloody saying? AVR.
AVR.
An AVR that could play back in Atmos. So I was
MP4,
able to actually check a speaker mix at home, which was, which I was incredibly lucky to be able
things.
to. Yeah. And then I was able to listen on headphones
speakers.
as well. So that was a big consideration, mixing.
And a lot of people will actually, because what Cam said is absolutely right. It's an important consideration what things are going to be listened to on, and there's got to be, you have to create the ability to be able to listen to on all of these platforms and not have something suffer. So you can't say, this sounds great with a big speaker system, but sounds like crap on binaural or the stereo fold down or 5.1 or whatever. Because what you need to remember with Dolby Atmos is that when it's streaming, whatever it delivers to, so whether it's a Apple 4K or an iPhone or an AVR or whatever, that device working with the Dolby codecs and formats will actually decide what the best format it is for you to listen to. So if it comes in an iPhone, it'll give you the binaural. If it comes into an AVR and it detects a 914 or 712 or 514 audio system, that's the format it'll give you. And that's part of the very clever, construction of this algorithm that Dolby's been able to do is deliver one file that will automatically fold down or fold up into whatever format you have. So you have to be cogent of all of those different formats and mix that way. In fact, a lot of engineers now say that you're better off to start mixing music in particular on a pair of headphones in the binaural, because that gives you that sort of foundational understanding of where your solid elements are lying, your bed elements, your kick, your bass, your snare, your vocal, and then start building out from there. And then, but to do that, because that gives you that foundation, and then you can listen to your room as well. But it is alchemy. It is definitely black magic, isn't it? And I mean, when Cam and I started this project, no one knew what Apple was delivering. Yeah, including the best engineers in the world. The guys, guys like Steve Jenowick at Capital who've been doing it for years. Well, he may have had an inkling, but I mean, if I've spoken to a lot of these people, and they're still arguing about it.
And it's hard to reference titles as well. So the only streaming platform that had Dolby Atmos music mixers in that was Tidal at the time. Now that I had that available on my Apple 4K TV at home, but that wasn't good enough. Like we couldn't bring that into the studio. You know, if you're in the studio, you can bring up Spotify or Apple and play a reference mix and then A/B between the two, or have a WAV file and throw that in. But you know, you can't get ADM files from artists, or it's just not out there. It's only lives in that architecture. So how do we compare? How do we reference that? So there's a lot of unknowns. It's a real problem for every professional engineer at the moment, because you know, to effectively be able to reference, you know, other recordings, contemporary recording stuff that's being released every day on Apple Music, as Cam pointed out, you know, you need an Apple 4K TV, an $8,000 or $10,000 AVR that's either got an AES or Dante output that you can plug straight into your system to listen to on the system. That's a very, you know, that's onerous for a lot of people. I mean, okay, you pick, you know, Capital Abbey Road, they're going to go, get 5 of them. But, you know, for me, it's not quite that simple. And it is something that's really important, because all engineers listen to other music to get inspiration, to compare what they're doing to that, you know, to benchmark. It's just part of the process. So to not be able to do that is frustrating. There is a bit of kit coming out, by the way, very soon.
What's that?
I can't tell you, but I will. As soon as I can, I will. It's been talked about on the forums for some time, and I know the developer who's a Kiwi guy, actually, very clever, and it'll be coming out soon. So you'll be the first to know, Chris, sir. Unknown person behind the camera.
Yeah, so that was obviously the big challenge, was getting them to be able to hear it. They're currently in the studio producing and mixing their own album at the moment. They don't have a Dolby Atmos room. And we couldn't get them to a room as well. I had these discussions with management to say, you know, can we pop them in a room and then I can do an export here and get them to listen to that? But that was just completely unattainable. So we had to just rely on the binaural for them. And the only way to QC that really was to get them to actually download the renderer himself and trial that and hear that as well. So, you know, initially for them, it's different. You know, it's different to the stereo intent. So there were things that had changed, and you know, when translating the same, it was very foreign. I think there was an element of them also being like, what is this? What are we talking about? You know, as most artists do, their heads so deeply buried in another thing. They're like, what's spatial audio? What is this thing? So, you know, we had those discussions. So that's when I had to really lean on the director, who's still Melbourne-based, which I was so fortunate for. He really was the ears on it, and detached in that he's not an engineer. You know, he's removed enough, but also understands the processes. And I really leaned on him. He was the real advocate for the band, because he was like, no, this makes sense, you know, like, and he sat there and we watched the film from start to finish. And I remember there was just silence across the room, and we're all sitting there going, God, does he hate it? Does he like it? And he's literally just sat up and he was like, I want to recut it. There was things that were coming into play that I just never heard or seen it in this intent before. So that was, a really big thing.
Yeah, I think it's going to die tomorrow. I'll be looking for a job probably. Look, I think, it's a really interesting time. Something we haven't talked about, which I've got to touch on, because I think it's such an incredibly crucial part of this whole big picture, is that, and it's not just happened with Apple Music, but it's been highlighted by that. So since streaming video and has been a thing, and streaming audio through Tidal and Spotify and so on, there are certain standards that have been implemented to aid in guaranteeing that the deliverable content is delivered in such a way that it's got a consistency and quality, which obviously makes perfectly good sense. ITU 1770-4 standard for, for sound states that it has to be delivered at minus 18 LKFS with a true peak of -1. Now, most people go, yeah, so what? What it means is that all of a sudden a normal stereo offering that's been mastered by an engineer in a traditional stereo mastering studio would normally be somewhere from -7 to -10. Like really loud is -7. Your average would be -9, -10. -18 is like 10 dB quieter. So all of a sudden we've just won the loudness wars, right, by default, because we're now at a point where dynamic range has a chance to come back into music, where, we can have extraordinary dynamic range in the way that classical and jazz music's had for years. Everything used to be hitting zero and just pounding it, limited up to within an inch of its life. So now that, to me, is one of the most incredible results of this whole exercise, that we now redefined how audio is going to be delivered to the public. Now, a lot of people are bitching about it because they're saying, oh, it's too quiet and I can't hear it. Well, that's what that volume control's for. Turn it up. But that, I think, can't be underestimated. Dolby Atmos, there's a few things. Firstly, Apple have put it into all their hardware. It's been in Android hardware for a long time, but a lot of people don't know that. But Dolby Atmos has been incorporated into a lot of Android hardware for a lot longer than Apple. Apple are just better marketers. But they've also, having adopted the Dolby Atmos platform for Apple Music is huge, as is the lossless that, Cam and I were talking about. So I think Alto, and it is, we've all heard it. It is amazing. When it's done well, it's amazing. When it's done badly, it's pretty awful. But when it's done well, it's amazing. And I think, like any new technology, there's going to be a learning curve. There's going to be, missteps and mistakes made, but ultimately the cream rises to the top. And I like to think that Dolby Atmos, in fact, a lot of people now, a lot of musicians are saying, oh my God, we're going to, after listening to it, saying we're going to now be writing for Dolby Atmos with that in mind, because the space that's available for us to place components of our music is so expansive now in a way that it never was with stereo. And while stereo has a long and honourable history in music, as did mono beforehand, and concert halls before that, before recorded music, it is an evolution that I really hope will continue, because I think at its best it's extraordinary, quite extraordinary, and offers us an experience for people that you can't get any other way, perhaps apart from being there, but even does things that being a live gig doesn't do. So yeah, I think it's great, and everyone, come and see me. Sorry. Yeah, web address. Yes. Shameless self-promotion here, lower third.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I think what's exciting is when artists will write with the intent of immersive audio. I'm really interested to see how that comes into play. With a project like this, with RÜFÜS, it buys into that cinematic feel. They write with sound design. They write with melody and sound design. And that electronic feeling comes into play when you listen to that in a 2-track. And you get that feeling. So as soon as you break it open into a room, you get more of that intent. You're like, that always feels like what that thing was supposed to do. If it went left to right, like that, then it feels like it wants to go around the room. So I'm excited to hear artists like that write with that intent. I think circling back to what I was saying before about learnings from this as well. I think as a mix engineer would be building it in the binaural sense from the start. Nothing will ever discount the magnitude of mixing in a speaker format, but getting back to what I was saying about what does the consumer listen to it on? They listen to it in binaural. So really there's a lot of weight on that. Start with that intent, mix from there, but then put it in the room. And get it to good mastering engineers as well. And isn't that so great that that exists even in this format as well? You can still have another set of ears on it. I just think it'll be great to hear what comes of it. And Apple's adapted it. So if Apple gets behind it, then you can't wave goodbye to it quite yet. It's here to stay for maybe a year. I don't know.
No,
it's
I'm
here
more
longer.
optimistic than that.
Yeah.